Hello and welcome to episode 309 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick here, as always, with
Jason Rabinowitz. And Ian, does it feel like this month has been the longest year of your life so far?
Sure does.
All right, that's episode 309. Thanks for listening.
So I put together an internal weekly brief. And I usually try to give them kind of a pithy title just so I can keep my sanity a little bit. And this week was a forward-looking one where I said, hopefully it's just a regular week this week.
Spoiler, it's only Wednesday, and it's not been the case.
There is big 30 Rock energy in this podcast today. We are definitely only Wednesday limited.
Ian, it's only Wednesday.
Yeah. So let's get into it.
All right, take it from the top. We'll work our way down and we'll have some good things, some fun things.
There are some good things. There are some good things. And there's some weird stuff that we really got to figure out if we're taking a trip to fly, because we'll get there.
We'll get to it.
In Chicago, no less, on the morning of Tuesday, so yesterday, the 25th of February, a FlexJet Challenger 350 crossed the runway in front of a Southwest Airlines 737 that was in the process of landing. The Southwest 737 initiated a go-around from a very low altitude, low enough that it was within the margin of error of ADS-B altitude data, which is 25 feet. So somewhere between 0 and 25 feet is how close the 737
It seemed like it was closer to 0 than closer to 25, looking at that video.
There was no smoke from the tires, but you could almost feel them touching down.
I said closer to 0, definitely not 0, but it was, I think, as close as anyone wants to get.
Mm-hmm. Any closer, it would have been a touch and go. So let's break down what happened.
And how we know it happened, I think, is an interesting twist I want to talk about a little bit.
Sure. So Midway has often been described as the busiest square mile in the world. And at one point, Midway Airport in Chicago was, in fact, the busiest airport in the world, and held that title for many, many years until O'Hare opened and all the traffic left. And that's a whole other history in and of itself. But Midway has since recovered and become basically, you could call it Southwest Airport, and everyone would forgive you for calling it that. But it does do a brisk business jet business. And in this case, the FlexJet Challenger was instructed, coming out of the FBO, was instructed to taxi down runway 4 left, cross 31 left, and hold short of runway 31 center, because the Southwest Airlines flight was cleared to land on runway 31 center. The FlexJet aircraft did not, in fact, hold short. And, well, it didn't hold at all, is really what we're getting at.
We need to back up even a second.
By all means.
The FlexJet crew improperly read back the instructions. And I believe at first their readback actually said cross the runway. And then the air traffic controller astutely picked up, whoa, that's not what I said, and reissued the command. And then the FlexJet flight crew read back correctly. And then they didn't do it. And then they crossed the runway.
Yeah. So, yes, the ground controller issued taxi instructions that were read back incorrectly. Not only were the turns incorrect, but also the runways in which they were supposed to hold short of and taxi across. They reversed the runway orientations. So they were supposed to taxi on 4 left. There was a mention of runway 22. They were supposed to hold short of runway 31 center. There was a mention of runway 13. Those are both reciprocals of the runways that they are supposed to be on. So definitely some confusion. The controller says negative. I'm going to tell you again. And he told him again.
And doing it in kind of a Chicago way where you could hear the annoyance in the voice of the controller having to repeat this. Not quite New York levels of, I can't believe you're making me do this, but Chicago style.
But Chicago style, yes. And then they didn't hold short. and crossed into the runway. And the Southwest pilots saw that and initiated a go-around.
Yes.
As we mentioned, the Southwest flight was feet from touching down, began a climb out. By the time they were crossing over the Flexjet aircraft, which was still slowly making its way across the runway, they were between 200 and 250 feet above ground level.
Not a whole lot, but, I'm going to give a round of applause to both the air traffic controllers who identified the incorrect readback from the Flexjet crew and the extremely alert Southwest flight crew for seeing that this was happening in front of them and initiating a go-around. As it was self-initiated, air traffic control did not tell them to go around. There just wasn't any time for that, and we'll actually get into what happened with the radio in a second.
Yeah, I think we can talk about that, yeah.
Yeah, the Southwest crew deserves a lot of credit for being aware. It's lucky that the conditions were very good at Midway at this point and they could see what was happening. This might be a very different conversation. Might have been a much close one, I guess you could say, if it was foggy or if it was raining or if it was snowing, like it could very well be in Chicago in the middle of February. So thankfully, the conditions were ripe for Southwest's crew to see this and avoid it.
Yeah, Jason brings up a really good point. Clear visibility made a big difference here rather than, you can only see halfway down the runway.
Yeah.
At touchdown. I mean, that's a really good point. The other thing that Jason brought up is the fidelity and usefulness of single channel VHF radios, in which if you accidentally press the button or if someone else is talking, your transmission is going to get stepped on.
And it seems like that happened in this case. We don't have the official FAA air traffic control recordings, but what we can hear ourselves recorded by Live ATC, which is not an official source, but it's what we've got. The air traffic controllers, I think it was on the ground frequency.
Yes, this was the ground frequency.
Yeah, they did get on the frequency and yell at Flexjet to stop, hold short, hold short. Well, what are you doing? They said something, but nobody could hear it, or if they could hear it, they couldn't understand it because someone else was already talking on the frequency. And this kind of identifies a major problem with air traffic control communications that occurs over analog voice radio as we know it today. If one person is talking, like Ian said, that's it. Nobody else can interrupt that broadcast. Nobody else can talk. If they do, everything just ends up being garbled. And that's what we call a blocked radio call. It happens a lot during busy times at busy airports. It can happen. People get very upset. Air traffic controllers get very upset if they're talking and somebody steps on what they're saying. That's what you call what happens if somebody transmits while you're talking. They've stepped on you and they've blocked everything because then whoever was talking has to repeat what they were just saying. This is an issue that exists in the world of analog radio. You cannot have multiple people broadcasting at the same time. I don't know how you resolve this when it comes down to real-time mission-critical things like issuing a hold short or go-around command. It's not exactly the kind of thing you can send as a text message like you might in lieu of high-frequency or oceanic communications, where a lot of that actually has been replaced by text messages, and you can send and even reply to text messages. But
yeah, CPDLC has almost entirely replaced voice communications over the ocean.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a good point, where a half a second could make the difference between, something bad happening and something bad not happening. Saying it is still the best way to go about it.
Yeah, it's just we're really pushing the capabilities of analog radio here. And I've never heard of any sort of initiative or even really discussion of replacing or even augmenting analog air traffic control airwaves with something digital, much like the railway industry has. At least in Europe, they have a version of the now ancient GSM standard called GSM-R, which stands for GSM Railway. Not that anything else uses GSM, so that should tell you how old this was. But I believe GSM-R actually does have, priority settings, so that if somebody is broadcasting on a frequency, if somebody else with a higher priority makes a call, everything else stops, and what they are saying is able to be heard over everything else. It's either a railways emergency call or shunting emergency call, something along those lines, but digital systems give you the capability to basically tell everyone to shut up, and what I'm saying is more important than what you're saying. That doesn't exist with analog radio. And I don't know what the solution is, because transitioning from analog to digital radio, at least from an avionics standpoint, is probably a decades-long initiative that, as far as I'm aware, hasn't even been discussed.
I mean, there have been discussions by some organizations and by some people who deal with aviation voice communications to upgrade this, but a lot of it has centered around increasing range and increasing fidelity, not necessarily a wholesale adoption of a new standard.
No.
So yeah, I mean, anytime you want to certify something for operational use in an aircraft, let alone, thousands and thousands of commercial aircraft, because the thing is you would have to maintain two standards for who knows how long.
Interoperability is a dream and a nightmare all at once. But when I say decades long, I do mean that. Something like this would take decades to implement.
Well, one day at a time.
Yes, but everything was okay. The Southwest flight, they went around, they landed back at Midway. It was probably always going to be fine. It ended up being fine. Did we talk about the Secretary of
No.
Transportation? No, we just move on.
I think that discussion is unhelpful in the sense that I think we've had that discussion where the injection of the Secretary of Transportation into historically straightforward regulatory matters is unhelpful. And we had that discussion last week. So I don't think there's anything new to say.
All right. So be it.
Let's go to San Francisco, where recalling a few years ago, where an Asiana Airlines 777,
that was like a decade ago.
The power and approach of the aircraft was mismanaged by the crew, leading to a short, crash. I was going to say landing, but less of a landing, more of a crash. So recalling that, we have a much different outcome this week in an incident involving Asiana as well. This week, we're talking about a low altitude alert that was received by air traffic control in the San Francisco Tower, but also, as Asiana states now, concurrently by the crew. And the crew at the time that they were alerted by the tower had commenced a go-around. Sure, what we know is that Asiana 212 was on approach to San Francisco International Airport's runway 28 left. Runway 28 left and 28 right are the parallel runways that run in this direction from the east to the west, and they were on a parallel approach with a Virgin Atlantic 787. They were cautioned by the tower controller a few times that they were in a parallel approach and that they were going to be landing runway 28 left. As they proceeded on the approach, they checked in with the tower, said, "We're here." Tower cleared them to land. They continued for a bit, and then all of a sudden you hear Asiana 212 Heavy, "Check your altitude immediately," because the tower had received a low altitude warning. Asiana commenced to go around, spent another about 20 minutes in the air, came back around and landed successfully the second time.
Whew. Feel like I've seen this episode before.
Yeah.
Different ending, but a lot of that was the same.
Yeah. Well, there were some differences in this case. Thankfully, speed wasn't an issue, or maybe not thankfully, depending on how you want to look at the management of the flight path. But what I did is I went in and pulled preceding and succeeding flights that were approaching runway 28 left at the same time. And what that demonstrates is that Asiana 212 approached much higher than the other aircraft and then passed through the glide path, to which point they received a low altitude alert. So the minimum GPS altitude was 450 feet for Asiana. And that's well below where other aircraft were at the same point. So without any correction, they would have gone into the bay. So thankfully, systems worked as they should have. Both the aircraft and the tower controller received an alert. The crew did what they're supposed to do, which is go around. They did and came back around. So the system worked.
All's well that ends well.
We'll take it. Asiana, for its part, says that they are reviewing anything that may need remedial action and taking steps to ensure the safety of all of their flights. So good for them. But, Jason.
Yes.
Sometimes a go-around is just a go-around.
Yes, this is a phenomenon that we see literally every time there is an actual aviation incident, accident, occurrence, noteworthy event that the mainstream media becomes hyper aware of the literally everything going on in the aviation space without actually knowing what's happening or if things are normal or if not. So anytime there is an incident, the media loves to pick up on go-arounds.
Yes.
And oh my God, a go-around happened. Where'd this one happen?
So this was DCA to U.S. Airways, Airbus, A319 and A320. So we're going
U.S.
back.
Airways? What?
Yes, these are old planes. But now operated by American Airlines.
As Cactus.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
So these particular aircraft, one was departing, one was arriving, and the departing one took too long to get going. And so the one arriving had to go around.
Oh.
This was a tower-initiated go-around. This was something that happens literally multiple times a day.
Even I have been on a flight that has gone around because the aircraft in front of us, Spirit aircraft, while I was on Delta, didn't get itself off the runway fast enough. This happens.
These things happen
so frequently at busy airports like LaGuardia or DCA. It is a fact of life when air traffic control is pumping the aircraft in as much as possible. Sometimes they're just not going to get off the runway in time for one reason or another. And going around is a good thing. That means the system is working and things are safe. It's when they don't go around. That's what you report on.
Yes. So having spent the better part of the morning talking down an editor from a major publication who unfortunately was putting all of this on a journalist who knew better. So that was a bit of fun, trying to explain that these things happen and this is the safe thing to do. If they don't go around, then there's an accident that we're reporting. So a go-around is always the safe thing to do. And it's what pilots train for. Like in every single simulator session that a pilot attends in recurrent training, they're going to practice go-arounds. So I looked this up. NASA did a study a few years ago, and they looked at a year of data, and go-arounds happen approximately 1 to 3 times every 1,000 landings. So taking the highest end of the value, so 3 per 1,000, and looking at number of commercial flights. I'm not even looking at general aviation or anything like that, just number of commercial flights that we track per day. That's roughly 375 go-arounds per day.
That's a lot.
It happens. This is worldwide. It happens all the time, every day, because that's the safe thing to do. Sometimes a go-around is just a go-around.
Usually, it's just a go-around.
More often than not.
Yeah, it becomes monotonous and difficult to talk about this time after time because we see it every single time. If you're listening to this podcast, you almost certainly know that this is the case.
There's a lot of preaching to the choir in the podcast.
I don't know who we're talking to, who our target audience is discussing this, but we kind of have to because it's ridiculous. But
we apologize in advance for Jason swallowing the microphone.
If you're listening to this and you're upset, so are we. But that's the game.
Our job is to educate and inform. And my goal is that the one person who has discovered this podcast in the intervening time that we have not talked about this goes, oh, okay, I feel better now.
Mm-hmm. And we're talking to that one person in particular, you.
Yeah, please let us know. So, I mean, that's the real goal here.
Oh, man, we are all over the place today. Let's move on to something.
Let's move on.
Oh, this next topic's not fun.
It is fun in an interesting way. So, in a big shift for a lot of industry organizations, there has now been roughly 25 industry organizations that include Airlines for America, which is the U.S. airline trade group, includes all the major American airlines and some others. NATCA, which is the Air Traffic Controllers Association. ALPA, which is one of the largest pilots unions. The National Business Aviation Association. The Airline Operator and Pilots Association, so folks who own private aircraft. Nearly 24 other organizations have come together to basically say, hey, it's time to revise how the FAA is funded, and they're no longer pushing the privatization of air traffic control, which was a big talking point over the past couple of years, especially during the first Trump administration. So this is a big shift. Industry groups have long called for a reconfiguration of how the FAA is funded. So the FAA is funded mostly by usage taxes on airlines, aircraft, and passengers. That money gets pooled into the FAA's pot of money that they can use. However, to access those funds requires an act of Congress. So the FAA, for years and years and years and years, has been funded by sporadic disbursements at various levels because Congress gets to control how much money the FAA gets. They say this is the mechanism for funding, but we get to decide how much you can withdraw from the bank. And so all of these industry organizations, 25 plus of them, have said, hey, it's time to standardize this, and it's time to provide multi-year authorization of funding so that the FAA is not beholden to any threats of government shutdown or closure or any external factors that can impact all of the things that we've all agreed are extremely important for the safety of the national airspace. And to me, the striking thing here is that you got all of these organizations to work together and sign on to the same letter, but also that they have pushed aside the ATC privatization issue, because that was a really big talking point, especially for a lot of the airlines, which were hammering that issue home as a way to say, hey, our delays are the fault of air traffic control, not of our operation.
Yeah.
So to have that talking point removed is interesting to me. Not to say that it was ever necessarily an entirely valid talking point, but to have them put that aside and say, okay, we're all getting together and we believe this particular thing now is interesting to me.
Yeah, privatization is not a silver bullet to fix a lot of things. As you were talking, I just searched on the internet, FAA privatization. And an article in, of all places, Long Island's newspaper Newsday, a guest essay by Robert Mann Jr., who you may know. I believe we have not talked to him on the podcast, but we are familiar with him.
Yes.
He penned a nice opinion piece on why this is not basically a cure-all for everything. And part of it looks north of the US to Canada. Things have not gone particularly well with NAV Canada, which is often pointed at as the poster child of if you privatize ATC, then things will be great. But even in Canada, things are not great. Apparently, in 2019, before COVID, they suffered a $100 million net loss for the year. That's not great. And if any Canadian flyers are listening, you have almost certainly been delayed due to NAV Canada traffic management protocols because there aren't enough air traffic controllers. The same issue we have now with the FAA, and that's a whole other thing. So privatization doesn't fix everything and leads to other issues. If NAV Canada is working on $100 million losses every year, they're certainly not going to have the money to toss back into upgrading systems and overhauling processes and data technology, whereas a dedicated stream of funding to the FAA, if spent wisely and appropriately, could, in a way that privatization just isn't really ever meant to do.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of things here that are all kind of coming to a head in a very weird way in the moment in which we live. So it's going to be interesting to see if any of the things that, and we'll put a link to the letter in the show notes because I think it's well worth a read. what comes of that and if that moves the needle for Congress at all. Because, again, it would take an act of Congress to change any of this.
Yeah. All right. That was a fun half hour. Let's speed on the second
Moving on.
2/3 of this podcast.
We can talk about the next two stories in 30 seconds because anyone who's listened to more than one episode over the past 2.5 years already knows what we're going to talk about here. Air New Zealand still being hammered by groundings from the Geared turbofans and Rolls-Royce engines on its 787s. Volaris is looking into 2027 to plan out how many Geared turbofan engines it's going to have on the ground. As of right now, they have 34 A320neo family aircraft in storage. This was an interesting thing. In their 2024 yearly results, the CEO of Volaris was speaking on their financial call and said that they, of course, have a deal with Pratt & Whitney. However, that deal does not cover any lost revenue to the airline. It only covers the direct costs of having those aircraft on the ground.
Well, that seems significant. Let's go back and just insert one of our prior rants about these engine issues and just copy paste it here because it's the same thing we've been saying for years. Like there's nothing new here. It's just ridiculous that this keeps on somehow getting worse while everyone at the same time says it's getting better. But yeah, ask Volaris if it's getting better because it doesn't seem like it is.
Not so much. They're looking at having nearly 36 aircraft on the ground for the next couple of years. Hey, we have good news. ANA just placed a big order of aircraft, and some of them are surprising.
Yes, it's been a while since we've had a blockbuster order from any airline, especially one this big, I think. When's the last time we've even talked about any kind of aircraft orders, except for everyone's favorite airline, undisclosed airlines? Those don't count.
Yeah, I mean, probably one of the air shows. I mean,
it's been a minute. But ANA, man, it's a big order seemingly out of nowhere. We're going to get to the most meaningful part at the end, I think. Let's save the best for last. But it's 18 787-9s plus 5 conversions of previous options, selecting the GE NX engine, not Rolls-Royce, which is interesting because those power all of ANA's other 787s. They firmed up 10 MAX 8 options, plus took on 8 additional, I believe. Peach will get 3 A321 XLRs and 10 regular A321 Neos, which is fun. Here's where it gets interesting. I did not see this coming. But in the wake of the Mitsubishi SpaceJet / MRJ, whatever it was called at its demise, not existing anymore, ANA needs something, and that will come in the form of 20 E190 E2s with delivery beginning in 2028. I did not see that coming.
Nor I. It's so funny to me that it's the E190 E2, which has been not unloved, but the least loved.
Are there any out there? I only know of E195. Yeah, I guess they're KLM, I think. Yeah, okay. There are a couple out there.
I mean, they're out there, but the E195 E2 has certainly been a much more popular.
More plain, more better.
More plain, more better. Although, I mean, in the case of ANA, what they're looking to fill is the gap between their Dash 8s and their 737s. And so the E190 E2 fits that slot pretty well.
Yeah, it slots right in where the Mitsubishi MRJ SpaceJet thing was supposed to go. But we know that ended up. Dreams of that aircraft are now in pieces, crushed, turning into beer cans in Moses Lake, Washington. Unfortunately, that aircraft will never happen. On the other side of the coin, with Embraer, the E175 E2 program is delayed by another 4 years. If ever, certification for the aircraft is now pushed to 2031. It was already postponed to 2027. It was originally unveiled in 2020, I think. That was the original target. That ain't happening. So this aircraft is now at least 11 years behind the initial timeline. I have thoughts about this that could go on for days. We've talked about this before, but it is sad that an updated, more economical, more eco-friendly version of an aircraft that is so wildly popular with the U.S. carriers is being pushed off indefinitely for reasons that really are artificial. It's just disappointing to hear that news.
Go Scope Clause.
Yay! And for those of you who may be more recent listeners, it has everything to do with the scope clause for U.S. carriers, where unfortunately the E-175-E2 exceeds the maximum takeoff weight limitation for aircraft up to 76 seats that the U.S. majors have agreed with their pilots to operate for a regional carrier. They'd have to be operated as a part of the mainline fleet, which ain't going to happen unless, I don't know what it would take for that to happen. It's just not going to happen. So you've got this perfectly good re-engined, re-winged aircraft, I think, that is more efficient than the aircraft U.S. carriers cannot stop buying, that they just cannot buy.
I mean, American bought a bunch of E-175s like a couple months ago, right?
I think they bought 1 billion of them because Embraer is just going to keep making them forever and ever, and it's going to be
the all the E-175s,
and these things are still going to be flying around from Dallas to Houston or whatever it is American does with them. But it's just not great.
And they're great planes. Like, I love the E-175. They are fantastic planes. If I'm going to be on a regional jet, I would love for it to be an E-175.
Yes. They ain't making CRJs of any type anymore. So Embraer's kind of cornered the market here, but come on. Let's figure this out.
All right. Speaking of figuring things out, Airbus is now expecting to close the acquisition of its chunk of Spirit Aerosystems by July 1st. They had previously been expecting to make that acquisition final earlier, but then what happened is they saw what was under the Spirit hood and said, that's not good.
Yeah, probably should have seen that coming, though.
Airbus says they finally understand what they're going to have to do. They're going to lose a lot of money up front as they try and work through everything, but then they are going to make money back. And the Boeing strike didn't help. They threw that in there just to kind of get another dig at Boeing from the Airbus side. So there you go.
Okay.
This is one that who could have possibly seen this one coming? The Russian government is passing a law. It's working its way through the Russian parliament so that they can manufacture spare parts. I apologize for the unintended podcast.
It has to continue. We needed a new co-host.
We'll resolve that.
If it's a cat, it's fine.
Yeah. So the Russian government is in the process of passing a law that will allow Russian manufacturers to legally manufacture illegal counterfeit parts for the aircraft that their airlines purloined from lessors in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine.
Nothing is illegal, Ian, if you make it legal. Take that piece of wisdom in.
I'm taking it somewhere.
Right to the trash.
This entire episode has been building up to this story because we need to figure this out.
And it needs to be real because, well, I don't want anything to do with it. But if you live in Madrid or Barcelona, maybe you want to be tortured for 11 hours in a 737 MAX?
We talked about this a little last week, but explain why this is starting to sound more real.
So this is coming exclusively from me to the listeners of this podcast. But last week, I think we talk about this? Maybe we talked about it. I'm not sure that we actually...
I think we mentioned it.
I don't know if we did. But Iberojet, a low-cost carrier in Spain, I believe, not typically a 737 MAX operator. I don't think they have any.
No, they have 330s and 350s.
330s and 350s filed last week in the global schedule system transatlantic flights on a 737 MAX 8, which they don't have, from Madrid and Barcelona to Orlando, Cancun, and a couple other Caribbean destinations, I believe. Some of these flights with block times of 11 plus hours, which is a lot. Normally, we would chalk this up to a mistake. Things happen, fat fingers, hit the wrong keys on a keyboard, and suddenly an A330 becomes a 737 MAX 8. That's a strange one.
As one does.
However, in the schedule, leading a bit of legitimacy to what we think is not real is that there's actually a filed configuration of this aircraft of an all-economy 123 seat configuration. It's one thing to fat finger the equipment type and modify a 350 to a 737 somehow, but it's an entirely different thing to also send with it a configuration of the aircraft that might lead you to believe that this is real, because these aircraft are probably 180-seat all-economy aircraft, and 123 is probably the maximum number you could hypothetically have on this ridiculous flight that is 11 hours over the Atlantic Ocean. If this were really a mistake, I'd expect it to say like Y180 or C12 Y250 or something like that to reference what the
looking at like an
configuration is
A330 or
on
A350.
a wide body. But to say Y123 on a 737 MAX 8 on a transatlantic flight, that checks out to me. So I don't know. Is this real? Is it not? It's also been in the schedule for like a week at this point.
Right, and no one's corrected it.
No one's corrected it. These kind of things are usually corrected within a day, 2 days, 3 days, but it's been there for about a week. So I personally want nothing to do with an 11-hour 737 flight. But I hope it's real, just to look at it and go, why?
I'm not going to take it. But if somebody else wants to take it and report in, we would love to hear how that goes.
Man, Barcelona to Cancun on a 737. That is going to be one ripe aircraft by the end of that flight. I don't know. I don't know if that's something that should be allowed. It's got to be against the Geneva Convention somewhere. Like that. This isn't right.
Last week, we discussed damp leasing.
Ugh.
And this week we're going to do it again. So in this context, damp leasing, as we talked about last week, is somewhere in between wet and dry leasing. And that means an airline gets plane and some of the crew, in this case, the pilots. And that's a Norse aircraft going to Indigo. So Norse to Go is starting with a 787 flight from Delhi to Bangkok beginning next week. So that's the first one. After that, they're going to take 3 more. Indigo is going to take 3 more Norse 787s on the same damp lease configuration. Those aircraft are going to be refocused come summer towards the European market. So you will see Norse 787s flying for an Indian airline between Indian airports and European airports. So that's going to be interesting. As what Indigo calls their internationalization effort continues. This is all in advance of a vast order of wide-body aircraft that Indigo has coming to it, but not for a while yet.
They just can't wait.
Wanted to get started quick.
They're really excited. I want to get going now. When this happens, will Norse have any aircraft left for its own operation? Or is it just going to transition over to a damp leasing carrier? Because that's also fine.
No. I mean, they have a variety of aircraft that are available for both wet, dry, and damp leasing. No, at the moment, let's see, they've got 12 Boeing 787s spread across 2 AOCs. And if I had to guess, I'd say that Indigo is going to end up with the 4 that are currently on the UK AOC. And that'll leave them with 8 that are on the Norwegian AOC for use wherever Norse sees fit to fly them. I'm sure at some point they will operate for Lufthansa via Discover Airlines, via Air Baltic, for
Alitalia. Powered by Alitalia.
Powered by Alitalia. There you go. Some interesting things coming, especially for Indigo as they ramp up kind of this first push into long-haul flying, or first push into first and a half push, because they do have those Turkish Airlines flights operating for them. But these are going to be more Indigo than the others. So moving towards more internationalization.
Good for them.
New or revived international flights coming on the heels of EASA removing the conflict zone notice from Iran, as well as additional commercial negotiations. Lufthansa and Austrian Airlines are reviving their Tehran flights come this weekend. Lufthansa beginning with a 3-time weekly flight from Frankfurt to Tehran on the Airbus A340-300, and Austrian will be operating twice a week using a combination of A320 and A320neo aircraft. So those will be starting back up come this weekend, and I guess at this point we'll see how long it lasts.
Yeah, these particular flights have a tendency to come and go, but operating with a 340, even if it's a 300, that's pretty significant. That's a lot of lift.
Yeah.
I feel like the last time they tried this, it was like the 319 they found under the couch cushions they put this on. But 340, that's a lot of seats.
I mean, if you look at, the demand coming out of Iran, there's a reason Mahan keeps finding ways to get A340-600s. Let's put it that way.
We've talked about that before, right?
Yeah, and there's a couple ex-Thai A340s that are not being used anymore that have new registrations that will definitely not end up in Iran.
Yep, something like that.
Hey, remember how we talked about Air Greenland's 757 last week?
I do.
In the context of
what did we get wrong? I feel like you're leading into something. No. Telling me we got something wrong.
We didn't get anything wrong, but I was doing some digging into the 757, that particular 757. And that particular 757, as we discussed last week, was eventually converted into a freighter and is now operating for DHL Austria. But what we also didn't discuss last week was that was the 757 that experienced the cargo door opened right after takeoff.
Oh, that one. We talked about that one.
We talked about that one when it happened, but we didn't talk about it in the context of that particular aircraft. So this week, the FAA, after this happening on more than one 757, issued a bulletin, not an airworthiness directive. They haven't gone that far, but they're saying, hey, if you've got a converted 757, check your locks, check your hatches, check your doors, and make sure that everything's working. So what they're saying is every 5,000 flight hours, go through the whole mechanism and make sure everything is the way it's supposed to be. There was an incident where an aircraft operating out of Russia to China was departing. This was an unconverted 757, was departing, and the door subsequently opened after takeoff. Everything was fine. They came back around for a safe landing. What they found is that the door had been operational to load and unload cargo over a long period of time in snow and ice. It was snowing and there was freezing rain causing ice accretion in the hatches and the locking mechanism. So what they found was that the door didn't actually fully close. And so what the FAA is saying, hey, if you're operating these aircraft, just make sure that the doors are working properly, because we don't want one of these to open and end up in a bad way at some point.
That's fair. That's good advice.
Yeah. So I just thought it was, kind of serendipitous that we talked about the former Air Greenland 757, and that's the aircraft that kind of set this safety notice.
The former Air Greenland 757 of door accidentally opening fame. Who knew?
Indeed. Jason, do we want to talk about which story do we want to cover next?
There's one weird but also creepy. Let's go with the weird one.
All right.
The first one.
Spiders.
Gross.
We've covered stories about, bees getting into pitot tubes, animals getting loose on aircraft, but this one, it just kind of all comes together. An Iberia flight was diverted
in the air
because a spider got loose on the aircraft, or was loose on the. I'm not sure if it was supposed to be loose or not, or supposed to be contained, or if it was just there somehow. But it bit the pilot, who's allergic to spiders.
That's not good. You don't want any of that to happen. Now, I've seen two versions of this. A tarantula, actually, or a spider, which I guess they're are they the same thing? Is a
tarantulas are spiders?
Okay. Well, specifically, it was a tarantula, which is for some reason.
Have you not seen Home Alone?
I mean, for some reason, to me, that's a lot scarier than if you say a spider. Like Black Widow's is a tiny little thing. A tarantula is a huge thing, fuzzy,
but
gross.
Tarantulas are big, but their bites don't really matter. Black Widows are much smaller, and they can kill you.
It depends what kind of Black Widow. They're different types.
Jason, I need to take you out on we need to have a whole separate, Jason learns how to survive.
There's different kinds of Black Widows. There's northern and southern, or maybe it's eastern versus western. There are different kinds, and I think the western ones are not deadly.
The moral of the story is that the Iberia A320 pilot was allergic.
Yes.
But fine.
They utilized the first aid kit, apparently, to do some sort of thing that apparently
they gave him an EpiPen.
There you go. EpiPen, he was okay, or she, we don't know. There's very little detail other than in big, bold, black text saying, then they fumigated the plane. because they
That spider
couldn't
is
find.
dead.
They could not find the spider, so they basically nuked the interior of the plane. And that tarantula, if it was still in the plane, was probably not too happy.
No, not happy anymore. And now the weird, creepy story.
Yeah, okay.
So we've talked about death on airplanes before, often in the context of a passenger dies mid-flight, an aircraft has to divert, or, they carry on and what they do with the deceased's remains. There are certain airlines and certain aircraft have dedicated spaces for people who have died en route. In this case, this was a Qatar Airways flight that was making its way to Venice, and a woman died in flight. This happens, from time to time, and it's a sad fact of air travel. There are millions and millions of people that fly every year, and some people die. However, the story here becomes the two passengers who then had to sit next to the deceased person for the remaining 4 hours of the flight.
That's not great. But
no,
it brings up an interesting point that in the olden days, and I'm going back 5, 7, 10 years, there were aircraft specifically designed for ultra long haul flights. And I'm talking about things like the Singapore Airlines A350-500 that was specifically outfit for ultra long haul flying between Singapore and New York/Newark, that I believe they actually had provisions for this exact case, since it was such a long
They
flight.
basically had an onboard morgue.
Yes. With other aircraft, traditional aircraft, be it your 787s or your A350s, pushing the bounds of what is technically capable, and you have normal quote unquote aircraft flying ultra long haul. Those aircraft are not specifically designed like Singapore outfitted its ultra long haul aircraft in the past. So situations like this, they do happen. And those aircraft are not designed like the very specific aircraft Singapore designed in the years past.
I wonder if Singapore's A350 ULRs are equipped similarly.
I don't know, but those flights aren't all that much longer than a lot of other flights that American or United or Qatar or Emirates operate these days. You don't need a super specialized aircraft to operate a 15-hour flight.
You just need a 787-9 and you're good to go.
There you go. So this is a legitimate problem. And in this case, the solution wasn't great, but there aren't many good solutions to this problem.
There are some circumstances here. The woman died after a medical incident, and the crew needed to get her out of the aisle, and so put her into a seat next to a couple. The couple is saying that they then had to sit next to this person, even though there were other seats available. If I'm those people, I raise my hand and say, "Hi, can we move, please?
Hi, are there any business class seats available on this aircraft?
Sure.
Because I would like
Any
to
other seats?
move." Yeah.
Like, I get not wanting to sit next to a deceased person. I completely understand that. But the way that they've kind of gone about trying to make hay of this, that this is somehow Qatar Airways' fault, that's weird to me. Because I feel like you could just say, "Hey, I would like to move."
I'd like to be reseated.
And knowing how Qatar Airways focuses on its passengers, they would have moved them to the flight deck, wherever.
I mean, ordinarily we'd write this off as like a nonsense story, but it was reported by the BBC, which I'm told is a reputable British news outlet. So there must be some degree of truth to this, I hope. But man, yeah, if this happens to you, just ask to move seats, because this is a very justified reason to ask for an upgrade. Or downgrade, or side grade, or literally anything.
Or just any difference, literally any other seat.
Go stand in the galley and hang out with the flight crew.
There you go. All right. Let's end there before anything else weird and creepy happens, and we call it a day. This has been episode 309 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.